Hey, welcome back to Unlatched Mind. Thanks for listening. Today we have Dr. Joe Herbert. Dr. Herbert is a professor of neuroscience over at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Herbert and I discuss the brain and gender and whether or not there are any differences between the male and female brain, whether or not there are differences in male and female behavior, and whether that's a result of any differences in the physical brain. So we touched on a lot of things. There's the political aspect and the gender inequality aspect that cropped up a little bit, which we circled around, but that wasn't the point of the discussion. But it was tough to avoid completely. Anyway, it was a good discussion. I enjoyed it. Hope you get something out of it. And with that, I'll stop talking and we'll jump in. Dr. Joe Herbert. Well, Joe, like I said, Dr. Herbert, I really do appreciate your time. So we'll just jump right in and we'll see where this goes.
Okay.
So I found you online. I found an article you wrote, which was on a subject that, can be touchy, right? It's the gender thing. Now you kept it completely scientific, right? And which is one of the prereqs for me. It's just to keep a lot of these discussions apolitical, and you certainly did that. Now, in prepping for this, I kind of, reading your article and it kind of used spider webs into a bunch of other things, which we'll get into. But and again, it's tough to maintain that until that line of keeping it, just purely science and less political. But the two definitely overlap, and I don't think you can truly discuss one without at least giving some time to the other. But anyway, with that being said, could you just give the listeners, I guess, a little background on who you are and what your area of specialty is?
Yes, sure. All right. Well, hello and a big handshake across the Atlantic. I'm an emeritus professor of neuroscience at Cambridge University in the UK. And my interests are concern the interaction between hormones and the brain. And that's a two-way interaction, of course. The hormones have a powerful effect upon the brain, both during development and during everyday life. And they also, of course, have a powerful effect on hormones that the brain does in order to regulate your body to adapt you or sometimes maladapt you to what's going on. For example, stress is a good example of that. It's a social or physiological experience, and your brain copes with it, but in various ways. At the same time, it will change your hormonal setup in order to help you cope with that particular stressful, demanding experience. So that's what I do, and I'm a medic, but I'm not a clinician. I work on both experimental and in human people, as it were, humans, and my human stuff is largely concerned with several things. First of all, depression, because I'm interested very much in the interaction between hormones and genes and social experience and physiology and psychology, and the risk for depression, particularly in young people, where it commonly occurs for the first time. And I also have an interest in financial decision making, which is related in some ways. That is the process by which people take decisions, particularly under high amounts of stress or demand or urgency, as, for example, in finance or indeed in war, actually. And the other, those are the two areas in human beings in experimental scenario. I've worked on a variety of things on sexual behavior in animals quite a lot, but also on stress and the way in which the brain makes or doesn't make new nerve cells, and how this is regulated by hormones. Anyway, that's my background. Just if I may add something about this idea of politics and science. Of course, scientists always say they try to keep them separate, but of course you can't, because the whole area of politics is a neural function. I mean, it operates through people's minds. And what is more, the decisions that people take or the political views people have or the possibilities that they recognize are determined by the brain. And the knowledge about the brain often influences what goes on in society. Sometimes it doesn't. I mean, in the area of gender equality, which we're talking about, I don't really think that neuroscience has had a great deal of effect on or influence on this area, although people are now trying to remedy that, and that's what we'll be talking about, of course. Mm-hmm. But the movement for gender equality, like the Me Too movement, for example, and all the rest of it, has come largely irrespective of what we think about the brain or what the brain does. It's been very much a social and political movement, generated, of course, largely by women, going right back to the 15th century or before, actually, when women began to complain about the fact that they had a subordinate status. So the question, of course, is now whether neuroscience really has anything to add to the debate about gender equality. And the reason that I've been drawn into it is that some of my colleagues think it has. And their main approach has been to try to deny the fact that there are any differences in male and female brains. And my viewpoint, which I thought we should elaborate on, is first of all, that's untrue. And secondly, it's irrelevant for the point of view of gender equality. But that's why I've become involved in this, because of the idea that there's such a thing as a male or a female, and what does that mean, both in physical terms and in psychological terms? And that's not a simple question, of course.
Well, you just touched on something, and I think, and you go through your fallacies, and we'll jump into some of the details of what your article kind of called out. But you just said something that I think is so poignant, and it was something that I was thinking the entire time while reviewing your material. When you look into this area and you look into a political hot button issue like gender equality and inequality in this case, there's always a conflation of multiple points. In my opinion, there's always a conflation of at least two big tenets, I'd say. And you say, and you just said this, and that's why I think it sets a good backdrop for folks listening. That I think you and I, we should be able to have these conversations without conflating two issues. And I think the two issues that we're conflating here is whether or not there's differences in male or female brains really has nothing to do with whether, the equality issue, right? I think we all, anyone that I would respect would believe that men and women should be treated identically in terms of, their we should be treat each other equally. I mean, just to be blatant, but that does not mean in any way that our brain, that we should be identical, right? And I think you more or less summarized that in the article, and you almost end with that. And I thought that was it's such a simple observation, but it really should lay the backdrop. And I think just kind of doing a little bit of research and a little bit of reading, after reading your article, I felt like, and I'm always trying to take a step back and say, well, am I, hey, I'm a white male. Am I biased in the way I receive things? And there's probably some of that, right? But I'm always trying to just dilute my own bias and just see the other side. And I feel like the articles that I was reading and those that continually try to dismiss any differences between male and female, whether how they think or whether there's a physical difference, whether it's a hormonal difference in behavior, or whether it's all socially constructed. I feel like there's this constant theme that those that want that go above and beyond to try to, I'd say, pursue equality for the right reasons, and then you get the extreme, feminism, the feminists on kind of take that to the extreme, and to your point, a lot of their points are well taken and in no way should be dismissed, but I feel like there's a lot of the as the relationship of I would say how vehemently for equality someone is. I feel like it's also a corollary to how much they want just things to be equal and how they want to just dismiss any differences. And I think there's a difference there, right? And I think those two things should be separated. We want equality, but we should also accept and study and report on differences. Correct?
Correct, but it's more complicated than that. You have to ask yourself why it is males have been the dominant gender for most of history and for most of societies. Not universally, of course, but because there's always there are always variations, and that does I think relate to the differences in the male brain. Male brains are set up to reproduce, and that's really what a male is there to do, and indeed females are there to do, to propagate and to allow the race or the species to continue. And that's true for all animals, of course. As you know, the Darwinian definition of success is how many offspring you have. Now, that, of course, has been overcome in human affairs, but it's still true for most animals. Now, let's consider why it is that males in history have dominated females. Well, the first obvious one, of course, is muscular strength. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're stronger than somebody, then you have a natural advantage. That, of course, is due largely to the hormone testosterone. If you give a woman large amounts of testosterone, she gets much stronger.
Sure.
And we know that because of the abuse of testosterone or related steroids by athletes,
sure.
Both in East Germany and more recently in Russia, but I'm sure other places as well. So the first thing is the physical strength. But of course, if you have physical strength, you need to be willing to use it, and that involves the ideas such as competitiveness, aggression, and risk taking, and all these things push an individual towards using his muscles to gain what he wants to gain by force or by the threat of force. And that indeed is a male brain. And again, it's not simple, because if you look at, for example, at females in a context of defending their young, they will show many of the characteristics that males show in a more general context. But one of the historical reasons why males have been dominant is because their brains are wired to encourage dominance, both between males. Males compete with each other, as you well know, for rank in a society or hierarchy, but also for control of their females. And the females may be a single one in the case of societies that have monogamy, but also, of course, in many societies, and indeed in other species where the males have polygamy, male needs a aggressive defense mechanism in order to protect his property from other males. And I think we shouldn't dismiss the role of brains in the generation of gender equality. But on top of that, we have another part of the brain, which is the part of the brain which recognizes these things and decides whether they are acceptable or not. Now, let's remember that in the vast tracts of human history, males have been perfectly comfortable with the idea of male dominance. And indeed, it has to be said, so are females. It's the natural order of things, they say. Well, this idea of natural is absolute nonsense when it comes to human beings, because everything we do is not, in quotes, natural. You don't naturally wear clothes. You don't naturally get on a Boeing and fly to San Francisco. You don't naturally get in your car. You don't naturally cook your hamburgers, and so on and so on and so on. So let's stop this idea of what is natural and what is not natural. It isn't. The other thing we have to get rid of is the idea that there's something about genetics and environment which is somehow separate, and that the male brain is large genetic or the male brain is large environment, which is what feminists would say. That argument's wrong too as well. Modern genetics shows very well that there's a huge interaction between the two. For example, your genes have a large determining factor in the kind of environment you seek or find comfortable. And what is more, that environment feeds back in your genes to make them work or not work.
Right.
It's called epigenetics. And so the idea that you can somehow balance these two influences, like water in two barrels, is simply out of date. And we should stop talking about nature versus nurture and talk about nature and nurture, and they're the same thing actually, or different components of the same thing. And that has direct influence on how we regard gender equality, because gender equality is a social concept, and it's a concept which current society is embracing slowly but progressively, and it has no relationship at all to whether or not male brains are different or more dominant or more aggressive than female brains, which they quite possibly are in some cases. Although again, we have to remember that when we talk about any differences between the gender, it's always overlapping. Even strength, for example. I began this conversation by talking about males being stronger than females. True in general, but I can think of a lot of women who are a lot stronger than I am, and I'm sure you know the same too, and vice versa. And clearly, if we were to meet an Olympic female javelin thrower, I don't think either of us would do very well, would we?
True. Right. But I guess for the sake of a lot of these discussions, you have to take the average to make a general stance, right?
Yes, you do. But you have to remember it's always an overlapping average. And that's true for gender equality, for gender identity, for sexual orientation, for whatever you want to talk about. There's always a range. And that's the difference, of course, between biology and physical sciences. In physical sciences, there's an exact value, and anything which varies from that value is an error. Whereas in biology, there's never an exact value. There's always a median value, as you quite rightly have said,
right.
but also a variation around that value.
Right. You always see a bell curve or statistics in every one of these studies, right? Because you have to, where's the meaty part of the curve? Right. And you just can't get away from saying 3 sigma or 6 sigma.
That's right. But the bell curve is a biological phenomenon, not a physical one.
Right.
I mean, the speed of light is not a bell curve.
Right. Exactly. Now, in your field, I mean, so it's not, you're in a field where, yes, the brain is an organ, but it's not the same as the liver, right? Obviously, you read a lot of, the liver, I don't think is going to be in the spotlight here for much to do with gender inequality conversations. But the brain, however, some articles you read just say, what did they call it? Some of the articles are saying that the gendered brain myth, right? And those folks obviously are arguing there are no differences, and those that are looking for differences are just, looking to justify their misogyny, which, I just can't imagine that's just good science. I feel like that is just, a bias, a political feeling, or some, whatever you want to call it. It's just influencing the scientific mind, and I think that's just a bad way to approach things. Have you seen that in your field?
Yes, very much so. I mean, there are two things here. There's the scientific investigation and the reason for it, which is a scientific reason we want to know, and then there's the application of that reason.
Right.
For example, okay, you split the atom. Okay, now you can do all sorts of things with that. You can cure cancer, you can run power stations, and you can make a bomb. You can argue about whether those are good or bad things, but they are different things. And let's take another example, which is an even more tricky one, which is the racial differences in intelligence. Now, I have no idea whether that exists or not, but for example, the study of that is a perfectly legitimate occupation and inquiry. The illegitimate part would come if you use that to imply that one race is inferior to another rather than being different.
Correct.
And that's the same thing with gender differences. We're not talking about inferiority or superiority. We're talking about differences. Of course, we all know that some men are better than some other men at some things. For example, I'm a rather bad mathematician. Okay, now I have friends who are actually extremely good ones. They're better at it than I am. So I can't argue about that. They're better. If we to put ourselves on a scale of mathematical prowess, they would be about half a mile further up that scale than I am. But who knows? I might have other qualities, which I can't think of at the moment, which might be better than theirs. So the question is, we cover a whole mix of things, and that's why we've got to be careful. Now, of course, in a situation where you need mathematics, okay, there's going to be superiority and inferiority. If you want to hire someone as an accountant, you've got to make sure he or she is good at maths. Otherwise, they're no good at being an accountant. So the difference here is inequality in achievement. That's a different issue indeed. That's why the whole argument about, or the whole discussion about gender equality is a complicated one. It isn't simply who is better at something than somebody else. it's because we have a whole range of abilities and contexts which those abilities are used. It's the gender equality argument is really a argument about opportunity. And anybody who has both the motivation and the ability to do anything should not be hindered because of their gender, or indeed anything else actually, but of course like poverty and whatever, education and all the rest of it. But it is part of a more general discussion about equality, about opportunity, which is what we're really talking about.
Right.
And we may end up, if we can imagine a gender equal world where gender no longer becomes an issue. No one ever thinks of it anymore, which is where we're hoping to get one day. It just isn't an issue. No one assumes, no one thinks for a moment that this gender has played any part in any sort of decision. The fact is, you may end up with 70% of nurses female, who knows? And you may end up with 70% of motor mechanics as male. I don't know. You may or may not. Would that upset me? Not in the slightest. You don't need to pass laws saying that it's got to be 50%.
Amen.
The laws have got the laws have got to be that any female who wants to be a motor mechanic has an absolutely unfettered opportunity for doing that.
Yes.
And the same thing, of course, for a male wanting to be a nurse. But there may well be things about the male and female brain which push people in different directions. And that is a mixture of their genes, their hormones, and their environment. But that shouldn't necessarily upset us, providing it's not a basis for discrimination.
Well, I mean, you touched on something there, and I guess we'll jump to that. I mean, in general, right? I mean, and I don't know, and you might be close to the actual studies here, but in general, you hear, these quotas that are popping up everywhere are, I just think they're crap. I'll just come out and say it, because I mean, I think a lot of these things happen as the pendulum swings. We're trying to swing the pendulum, to the in the proper direction to overcorrect, to correct, I should say, and then we overcorrect because there are misogynist pigs out there. There are racist pigs out there. The reality is, humans are flawed, and I try to, at all times look at the world and kind of poo-poo the things that I see are, whether it's racism, whether it's misogyny, whether it's whatever it might be. I don't even count that in the way I approach people in the world. So when I see companies and that are trying to swing the pendulum the other way with quotas and things like that cause this unnatural, just really unnatural kind of flow and progress, in my opinion.
Yes.
I just push back on it, and sometimes that can come across as that. And I've never really reached this point, but I really, I can personally feel the eggshells that I have to walk on to make those points where, I mean, just as an example, if I was a recruiter for a company, right? In my opinion, we should be getting, I should only, and I think in any company, right? You should just look at resumes without the name or even gender, anything attached to it. I just want to see the qualifications. Now, what's wrong with that?
You're right.
I don't care what your name is, where you come from. I just want to see your qualifications. And if I speak to you and you're qualified, I literally don't care. And I don't even know anyone that cares, frankly.
You're right.
So,
but don't forget, you've got to go back a bit, because those qualifications have been obtained, and you've got to make sure, society has got to make sure that gender is no obstruction to getting those qualifications.
Good point.
In other words, the point is that people who end up at the interviews, it's too late. I mean, the whole process should have begun 20 years or whatever it is earlier, to make sure these people have the kind of opportunities everybody else has.
Right. True.
Why don't we go back to some of the science now and say, okay, is there difference in the brain? And because I know quite a number of female neuroscientists who object to that idea. And I've had some very brisk correspondence with them, as a matter of fact, as you might imagine.
It's a good word for it, brisk. It's very nice.
No, we do stay friends, I must say. We don't hate each other.
So it should be.
We don't agree. We don't agree, but we don't say. In fact, I gave a talk in one of their home universities recently, and it was all very friendly, even though I was saying things were directly counter what the lady in question was proposing.
That's what adults are supposed to do, right? That's perfect. That's great.
Is there a difference in the brain? Well, now, should there be? Two things. The chromosomes of a male are different from female, XY and XX. Okay. Now, the first thing you're going to say is, if there are no differences, then those chromosomes have absolutely nothing to do with the brain at all. That's completely incredible. Of course they do. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that the Y chromosome does, which is the one all males have, is that it makes a testis during embryonic development in the womb. And that little testis pumps out masses and masses of testosterone at a very early stage. And that does things to the brain, as everything else too. So we know this happens, and we know from experimental work on other animals some of the differences that you can see. But this brings us to the next problem: what is a sex difference, a gender difference? And that's a much more difficult question, because contemporary neuroscience really doesn't know what to look for. As I said in my article, the crudest thing is to look for differences in sizes of bits of the brain, and that's what scanning does. That's a totally useless approach. The brain isn't a muscle. I mean, and people, 19th century mostly German neuroscientists spent many years trying to understand why some people are so-called geniuses. And they looked at their brains and saw bits were bigger, bits were smaller. The famous one is Albert Einstein, whose brain, in fact, was kidnapped, actually, and was examined by a number of scientists.
Oh, I didn't know that, really.
And of course, these studies have been totally uninformative. First of all, sizes, so what? And secondly, if you do get a bigger size somewhere, how do you interpret it? Because no one knows what that bit really does or why a bigger one should do it. So that's the most superficial way of looking at the brain. Now, of course, size in some ways does matter. I mean, we have a big brain compared with our body size, and that matters. And the front of the brain, called the frontal lobes, is even bigger. If you look at a chimpanzee brain, which looks very like a human brain, you'll see that the front of a chimpanzee brain is noticeably smaller than that of a human, and that does matter. So, in a sense, I'm contradicting myself in the sense that I'm saying at an overall species level, size matters, but at an individual level, that's much less certain. So, what else do we look for? Well, the other thing we look for, the brain is made up of clumps of nerve cells. They're called nuclei. And each nucleus is a kind of collection of nerve cells which operates like a little machine, and it communicates with other little machines in the brain to make one big machine, which is the brain. Now, there are some nuclei in the human brain which are bigger in the males than females. It's more prominent and more well-studied in other animals. In rats, for example, where there's a well-known difference, several well-known differences. But again, even in a rat, which you can study experimentally, we don't know what those differences are doing and how they do it. So my point is here, if you're looking for gender differences in the brain, you've got to justify why it is you're doing it from a scientific point of view. And I'm not sure that's, at the moment, a particularly strong argument. Because if I were to find one, how would I interpret it? I would simply report it and say, look, it's different. And everyone would say, oh, good, and actually we don't agree, and we'll do it again, find something different. But even if we do agree, where are we? So the overall tendency, if you take all the different ways of looking at the brain, and I won't go through them all because there are a lot of them, that there are differences in gender-related differences in the brain, and they also, some of them apply to human beings, as you would expect. There's no reason why they shouldn't, because recognizing the different biological functions of males and females, which are to some degree separate, or again, as we always said, some degree overlapping. This will be reflected in brain structure and function. The problem is that we can't relate brain structure and function to behavior in a very good way, certainly not in a way which accounts for some of the reported differences in male and female behavior.
Right.
For example, risk-taking. I don't know whether you hang glide, Vinny,
I don't, but I know where you're going with this.
Or do you surf, or maybe you drive rather too fast in a red sports car?
My wife would say I
No?
drive like an old lady, but no, I do. I would say I'm certainly more risk taking, quote unquote, than my wife or
Yeah.
than other
But,
folks that I
but,
know
but,
that yeah.
but you fancy yourself in a red Ferrari, don't
I'm
you?
sure. Who doesn't?
Going,
What male
going,
doesn't,
going
right?
around. That's much better. I'm glad you're going to
Yeah,
say
yeah,
that.
yeah.
All right. Well, there we are. Now, okay, you can argue about whether that's social, whether that's genetic or whatever. As I said to you earlier on, that argument is totally sterile and it gets us nowhere. But there are differences in behavior and inclination in many males, many females, and that is going to be represented in some way in differences in their brain, because that's why they're different. But what they are, I can't tell you.
Right. Now,
That's the end of that bit.
now, right. But on the other side, they'd say that's completely socially constructed.
But my point is more than that, is that this idea of separating genetic or early events and social construction is not a realistic and separate thing. The two interact with each other, and the person you get is a product of those two things. And arguing that one is more than the other is pointless, because we know that both have powerful influences on the kind of person you are. Here we're talking about not about gender differences, we're talking about individuality. But of course, your gender is part of your individuality.
Sure.
You have two children, as I think you said, and they are very different, one male, one female. Okay, now there are those that would say, okay, it's simply because you treat them differently. And if you treat your little boy like a little girl, he will be much more like a little girl, a little boy.
Right.
The evidence for that is not at all good.
No, I can speak from experience. It's not, right?
And it doesn't matter, because we're not trying to make people homogenous. We're not trying to abolish gender differences. We're trying to remove them as a source for social and financial and political inequality.
Absolutely.
So, as I said to you earlier on, you don't want a homogenous world, a grey world. That'd be terrible. You want a brightly coloured world, and the colours come in all sorts of ranges, one of which is gender identity or gender role or gender differences, and they're all different, and they all add to the variety of world, but they're not the only source of variety. The differences in intelligence or upbringing or culture or social experience or adversity or just bad luck. I mean, if you happen to be in a shopping mall in the wrong moment, you might get shot.
Right.
That's nothing to do with nothing to do with your brain. It's just happenstance.
Right.
Although there are those actually who would say it isn't. It's all kind of forewarned and foreordained.
Right.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that.
Right.
There are those that will.
Now,
okay, so that's my take on gender differences.
Now, in terms of the current science, this you talk a lot about the different scanning techniques, and what I took from your articles, the scans don't really show much. At least.
No, they don't.
Yeah, and I read a few other articles that claim there's some differences in imaging that show this and that, but nothing definitive. I couldn't find anything definitive, and I'm a complete layman in this world. But just reading your article, I think that the scans are not showing many differences. Are there anything? Is there anything on the horizon that looks promising?
The scanning, there's also different ways of scan, and I won't go into details, but there are different ways of looking at scanning, and they give different sorts of information. The one we've been mostly talking about is MRI, which gives you basically a picture of the size of the brain or what it looks like. And that's hugely valuable in some circumstances. If you've got a tumor in your brain, that'll show up. If you had a stroke, it'll show up. If you've got a degenerating disease like multiple sclerosis, it will show up. And these scans, therefore, are used all the time. I go to clinical meetings once a week, and every case has a scan. And in some cases, it's highly informative. But when you get to the level of individual differences in the, in quotes, normal, unquote, brain, it's absolutely useless. And it's the fact that people aren't finding any differences is what's called a type 2 error. That is, that the methods you're using are not sufficient to show those differences if they exist. And that is true for scanning.
Right.
Now, there are some other ways of looking at the brain, And a more recent one looks at connections, different parts of the brain, how the brain talks to itself, if you like. And they have shown quite marked gender differences in some studies. Again, what this means is totally obscure. Of course, the people who write these papers always offer an explanation, but it's speculation. And whether or not this is a true gender difference, and if so, what implications does it have for behavior, is for the future. So I would say to you, Vinny, that the current methods of studying the living human brain are simply nowhere near good enough to show gender differences, even if those gender differences had any meaning.
Right. Now, do you think, some might be listening and saying, hey, why do you even care, right? And you think you brought up a point earlier and you kind of touched on this, but do you feel like the study of male versus female, just speaking strictly from anatomy, not just the brain itself, has the study of the differences or the desire to know the differences between male and female brain, has that accelerated due to the political climate over the past decade plus? I would say, are scientists are getting interested in the differences, potential differences in male versus female brain, do you see in your field, because of the political climate, or is it, maybe it's a chicken or the egg thing, but because some folks would say, hey, you guys are trying to find a difference, the science is looking for a difference because because of this, you want to find some justification to some inequality, which I think is certainly not the case in us talking, anyone that we know. But do you feel that that's happening?
Depends who you are. There is a small group of feminist neuroscientists who are doing exactly that. They are using brain imaging techniques as a stick for their arguments. As I've said to you before, it's firstly wrong and unnecessary. It doesn't help argument. It hinders it because it's irrelevant, and also it's incorrect. I mean, the fact that they deny gender differences in the brain on the basis of their techniques is simply wrong. It's not acceptable because the evidence is not good enough. But of course, there are many other reasons for looking at gender differences. I mean, the first of all is to understand sexuality. I mean, that has been a long, long history of that, and that's a very legitimate and very important. I don't need to tell you this, but sexuality is a rather important aspect of human existence, sure, as indeed every other. And of course, things like sexual orientation and gender identity and homosexuality, can we understand what happens in people's brains to regulate these things? These are issues of huge interest and huge importance. And then there's the question of mental disorders. There are mental disorders which have marked differences in gender. For example, autism is much more common in males than females. Depression, the other way around. And eating disorders, very common in females. That's a mental disorder. And in order to understand why this is so, we need to understand what's different about the brains of females and males and females, and of course, how they react to the environment, which plays a part, certainly in the latter two conditions, if not in autism. So the reason for studying gender differences varies according to who you are and what you are.
Right. Now, and I asked that question because I did start to stumble upon some articles talking about that there's the only reason to do these studies, and the only reason that neuroscience is taking an uptick in studying, trying to identify differences is to start to identify and justify some of the misogyny, which, I don't fall for that. There might be some that do that, and, they should be called out if that's the case. I mean, but then I started reading other articles, and I started stumbling on some really good points where some of the FDA recommendations for and how drugs are administered is the rules and regulations there are pretty critical when it comes to gender, because there's certain I don't remember the details, but certain drugs affect hormones very differently and affect males or females very differently. So the dosages literally matter and how they're prescribed.
Indeed.
So that's one great, completely scientific reason as to why we should understand the differences, right?
Absolutely right. This is a part of a whole new movement, which you might call personalized medicine, which is that you don't treat every patient as just a human being, you treat them as a particular human being with particular characteristics. And of course, as you know, the recent upsurge in genetic studies has accelerated that. But there are other ways of looking at it too, and it's an extremely important area of medicine where sooner or later treatments and the way which your doctor will address your condition will depend not only on the condition but the kind of person you are with that condition.
Right.
And that's an extreme. And gender differences are one aspect of that, only one aspect of it, but they are an important aspect of it. You're quite right. There are increasing evidence now that males and females respond differently in general to certain drugs. Of course, I keep saying this, there'll be overlaps. Some females will look much more like the median male response, and some males vice versa. But again, that has to be determined on an individual basis.
Now, I mean, do you find it that just being a male is there? I mean, the two of us, just two white males having this conversation is probably we're already kind of screwed. But
not at all.
I think
one last thing about human. One thing about the brain. We've got to remember this amazing human brain, and it is truly, truly amazing. I've been a neuroscientist now for about God knows how many years. I wake every morning amazed about the thing inside my head and in your head, which is you, the personality, the intelligence, and of course this great problem of consciousness, which we all worry about. Now, that great human brain is able not only to recognize gender differences for what they are, but also take them into account. We talked earlier on about politics and society. Now, the fact that society has changed its views on gender roles over the last, several hundred years, is not due to gender differences in the brain. It's due to the fact that we have, on top of these gender differences, this amazing brain which can assess the kind of society we want to live in and operate accordingly. So, for example, unlike, for example, our Victorian or medieval forefathers, we have unemployment benefits, whereas if you were unemployed in 16th century England, you'd actually starve to death unless someone helped you out, and now you don't. So we've decided that society is a more communal and generous activity. So we provide, in your country, I guess they call food stamps, aren't they? Whereas in my country, they call unemployment benefit. And they're the same thing. They're the same thing like minimum wages and taxes, which are varied according to how much you earn, and so on and so on, to try to make society less unequal.
Right. General concern for each other.
A rather losing battle, I must tell you, in both our countries. But nevertheless, it's a good objective. All these things are due to the, if you like, the particular human characteristics of the human brain. Chimpanzees don't have unemployment benefit. Rats don't look after each other, haven't got any food, and so on. We have this astonishing way of making complex societies which, on the whole, benefit individuals. Sometimes, of course, don't, but can do.
Right.
And that's the part of the brain we shouldn't forget about, because on top of all these gender differences we're talking about, there is the great human, it's called the cortex in neuroscientific terms, this wrinkly thing which makes up most of your brain. Looks like a curious, it looks like a wrinkled grayish pink substance, and that's made up actually of a folded sheet, a thick sheet of very active nerve cells. And those nerve cells actually are not particularly interested in gender differences, although there may well be some. What they're really interested in the context of our conversation is how those gender differences impact society and whether we allow them or permit them to do one thing or another. We have a choice, always a choice. And that's the big human gift, that we can alter the society we live in, alter what we do, alter our technology. And you don't find this really in other animals. Of course, they adapt to circumstances. They do. Particularly rats, for example, can live in deep freezes and so on. But you don't see the kind of progressive evolution of society norms and structure, which you see in human beings, or indeed the variation. I mean, the social structure in your country is rather similar to mine, if I may say so. One or two sharp differences, which I won't mention. And but let's take, for example, Saudi Arabia, which is an obvious difference. I mean, the difference there between gender equality there, although that's to a slight degree improving, and here is very marked.
Oh, yeah.
Now, we're all human beings. I mean, the brains of a Saudi Arabian is no fundamentally different from the brains of a Midwestern American. But the fact remains, they have evolved a distinctly different sort of society. Now, you don't get that in rats or chimpanzees or anybody else. And that we've got to remember that for the human brain, it's capable of doing remarkable things. And that also applies to the abolition of gender as a factor in opportunity.
Now, you touched on, you kind of circled on something. I just wanted to bring this up a little bit off topic, but as a neuroscientist, I always like to ask this question: What are your thoughts on brain versus the mind? Is it just a clump of nerve cells that is so complex that there's so many complex processes running through there that we exhibit mindful type attributes, or is there something else going on there? What are your thoughts?
No, there's nothing else going on there. Your mind is a function of brain, just like flight is a function of wings, or walking is a function of legs. There's no need. Listen, if you damage your brain, you damage your mind. There's no need to postulate, although some people do, there's something called the mind outside the brain, because everything we know about the mind, and it's a huge area, and I won't go into it, is accounted for by what we know the brain does. And of course makes the brain even more remarkable than I've said.
Right.
And that's why every morning I tell myself what a remarkable structure and what an impossibly difficult structure I'm actually studying. That is why, Vinny, neuroscience is primitive. I tell my students this. I say, look, I'm a professor of neuroscience at Cambridge, but I know a little about the brain. And they all laugh and think I'm being modest or funny or something. I'm not. I'm actually being absolutely truthful. You can see this, can't you, from the way in which the ability to which we can treat the brain when it goes wrong. It's very unsatisfactory.
Right, it doesn't.
Mental disorders are not well treated. Strokes are not particularly well treated. Brain tumors are bad. Brain tumors are very unsatisfactory, and so on. Degeneration of the brain we can't put right. Brain damage in accidents. Many young men get themselves driving these red sports cars, get themselves damaged in various ways, spinal cord or their head. The ability to help them recover is very limited compared, for example, shall we say, to the heart, which we can actually replace or restructure the valves. Right. You mentioned the liver earlier on. Well, we know how the liver works. We know how it works. Not everything about it, but we know it's not a mystery. Right. The way the brain works is a mystery, Vinny. I can't tell you how it is. You are now understanding what I'm saying.
Yeah,
to you.
Well, one of the final questions I had for you was exactly that. And from my layman's perspective, I feel like we just, like to your example, compared to the liver, the lungs, the heart, it seems that we're just scratching the surface of of understanding how the brain truly works. And
we can agree on that, Vinny. We can agree on that. And the sad thing is that neither of us will live long enough to understand much more. It's a bit sad, that is. That's the only reason I regret getting older. And I won't see what's going to happen next.
Is there anything promising on the horizon in the field in general that you're really excited about?
Well, there's a huge amount of activity in neuroscience, but a large amount of the exciting advances have been at the level of the cells of the brain, there are two sorts of cells of the brain: the nerve cells, neurons, and the cells which surround them called glia. And they are very important as well. And we know a lot more about how they function at an individual level, a lot more about that. And that's very exciting and very interesting and very necessary. The problem is the brain works as an assembly. And once you get an assembly of a few thousand neurons hooking up together, you've got a very different problem. How do they work? We know enough about this to know that they behave in a way which is very difficult to predict from the behavior of every single neuron. And that, of course, is how the brain does work. Now, in the liver and the heart, we know how the assemblies work. You know, the heart works as a pump. We know how the muscles are arranged. Now they work together to produce the pumping force. We know how the liver cells work together to process the food you eat, and so on and so forth. We do not know how a clump of nerve cells in the brain generates an emotion, a thought, whatever. We don't understand that. And certainly, of course, a memory. Memory is still a complete mystery, really. I mean, we know something about it. So we know something about bits of the brain that are involved in it. But how they do it is still a long way off. And you're quite right. It's a subject which is way behind the others, as you would expect, because that's proportionate not to the intelligence of neuroscientists, but to the complexity of the problem. We're dealing here with a structure which is by far the most complex in the known world. Nothing comes near the human brain in complexity.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It really is. And you think once, and you know, at some point in the future, you know, you said you and I won't be alive to see it, and I agree there. At some point, once we truly understand how memory works, for example, there'll be a pill to enhance that, right? There'll be some, okay, now, you know, my IQ was this, now my IQ is going to be, you know, 2x that. Yeah. And there's no such drugs out there. There's not even things that hint to that. I mean, I guess there's some of these things, nootropics, they call them, right? I don't know how much they actually do, but nothing marked that I've seen, because that's going to be interesting.
They don't do very much. I'm sorry to tell you.
What's that?
You're quite right. You're quite right. Let's take memory as an important thing. I mean, again, this is interesting. This has a gender difference because women will remember things associated with their children in general, a way which men will not. I don't know if that's true in your family.
My wife's memory is about 10 times better than mine, at least, and I think that's being conservative.
About your children, or about everything?
In general, yes, everything.
They remember, okay, well, I'm talking about context-related memory. Again, that does show. So I won't go, I can overdo this, but you could postulate there are gender differences in that too. But of course, we can't explain those until we can explain memory. Right. And I can tell you which parts of the brain are concerned with memory to a degree. There's a famous case in Canada of a man who lost his memories most of his entire life, and he was studied until he died. And that demonstrated basically what we already knew, which was a certain part of the brain called the hippocampus is very important for memory. Yes, good. How does it do it?
Yeah, that's right. Oh, man. Well, Joe, I do appreciate your time here. I want to be respectful. I think we talked about an hour. So anything else you wanted to leave the listeners with?
No, Vinny, I've enjoyed our conversation. I hope it's other people enjoy it. You never know; they may or may not.
No, I think this was great.
And I will continue my battle with the feminist neuroscientists, and you will continue your very worthwhile objective of informing the population, which is very good.
Well, Joe, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Goodbye, Vinny.
Goodbye. And that's a wrap. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time. See ya.